Hello everyone, it is 9:43 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, January the 7th in the year that we're told, 2024. Today is brief number 56, which I'm entitling The Arm, and it is also my first sponsored brief. Yes, today's brief was brought to us by David Schaefer. I'd like to remind everyone that you can sponsor your own brief by sending a donation of $200 USD to either the PayPal or Venmo account linked in the description. Also, if you'd like to support my work, please visit the Amazon page for The Bible versus the Middle East, Volume 1, which I just published about a week and a half ago. It is an excellent, good-sized book that I promise is full of some really great revelations and ammunitions to be used against those who still believe in the Middle Eastern model. As well as if you would visit my Creator Spring page, as there are a lot of products there that are well-designed, good products that also go to help supporting the work that I do in a more full-time capacity. So, now with that said, let me close these things out and get to our subject, to my notes, and I will bring them up just a bit here so that they're very easy to see. So this has everything to do with Isaiah 53, and I want to actually expand it a little bit and say this has a lot to do with a great deal of content, really, found throughout the book of Isaiah, not just 53. I know a lot of people focus on Isaiah 53 because Isaiah 53 appears to be, based on the language, a very Messianic passage or a full chapter that seems to be directed entirely towards Jesus. So this is the idea. Now, I think it just responsible to take a look at this instead of just assuming. There's one of our problems. If we're typically, I think most of us that would even be listening to this, were raised in a Sunday school environment, or in some way, maybe we were told by our parents that all of these prophecies, or apparent prophecies, that we see in the Old Testament, they're about Jesus. In fact, I remember years ago in a Bible study that I was in, somebody was really trying to get everybody in there to read a book they had called Jesus on Every Page, which, from what they said, because I didn't read it, from what they said, is essentially citing how you can see Jesus on every single page of the Old Testament throughout the entirety of the Old Testament, which I think at the time I didn't see that as extreme because I, like so many others, was raised from, the youngest age, being taken to Sunday schools and being taught those exact ideas. But the thing is, if we're going to be responsible and we're going to believe that this Jesus that we see depicted in the New Testament is in fact this Messiah figure that appears to be prophesied of in the Old Testament, and there's a reason I say appears to be. If we're going to believe that, and if we're going to put our faith in that, we're going to anchor our life or bet our life or death or afterlife on that, then I think it's only responsible if we are sure, if we make absolutely sure that these passages that are supposed to clearly indicate the coming of this great Savior and Messiah, in fact, actually do that. So the first thing that I want to do in establishing whether or not Isaiah 53 in particular is about the New Testament Jesus. I want to see the context of the book of Isaiah. If we don't have a context that's understandable, that we can understand, okay, somebody wrote or said a certain thing within the context of this setting, to or for these people, this is what's going on, then all we really have is a lot of random text. And the problem with a lot of random text is that, and a lot of us would know because we've seen this. A lot of us have seen this just in the context of being Christians. And let's say listening to the more scholarly Christians that are out there, they will point out how people will use eisegesis. And what's that? It is extracting text from its context. And if we pull text out of context, unfortunately, we can do anything we want with it. And so the one thing we definitely want to avoid, if we're examining any text to see if it's a prophecy about someone or something or whatever, we want to make sure that we don't make that mistake of isolating just those passages which seem to be saying whatever they seem to be saying from all of the text around them and from the book and the setting. We want to see what we can get from whatever book it is and what context that book tells us about. So with Isaiah, the book of Isaiah actually starts out where he tells us exactly the time frame. So he gives us a really good idea of what the context is right at the start. Because Isaiah 1:1, it says, the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Now, I'm going to explain to you what the context is and what was happening then, but by all means, check this for yourself. You can check this in, for instance, the books of Kings and Chronicles to make sure that I'm telling you exactly what was going on. What was going on was that in the time of from Uzziah to Ahaz, there was the impending threat of the kings of Israel and Aram, which is typically changed to Syria, but it is Aram. And especially in the time of Ahaz, just before Hezekiah. They were concerned that they were going to conspire together, which they were, the king of Israel and the king of Aram, to come down and utterly take over and perhaps destroy Judah as they knew it. And perhaps the aristocracy of Judah, of course, Ahaz was most worried about this happening. So Ahaz is given a prophecy in Isaiah 7 about Assyria coming down against the kings of Aram and the kings, or the king of Israel. And this did, in fact, come to pass. And Assyria actually took over a great deal of land. I mean, a majority, it would seem, of the territories that had been presided over by Israel and Aram. But the problem was, of course, that that wasn't good enough for the king of Assyria. So he set his sight on a lot of territories or cities in Judah. And he actually, Sennacherib, his captain, took over a number of these cities. And then they set their sights on Jerusalem. And then there is the whole story that is accounted in both Isaiah and in the books of Kings and Chronicles about this king coming up against Jerusalem and 185,000 of his men dying overnight after King Hezekiah prayed this prayer to Yahweh that Jerusalem wouldn't fall and that Yahweh would be glorified in this thing happening. And then it happened. So I'm relating to you as the story goes and what the time frames are. Then what happens after this big event? A little bit after this, Hezekiah, he falls ill. Isaiah goes to Hezekiah, says he's going to die. Hezekiah prays again and pleads for his life. And in response, he's actually granted 15 more years. After this happens, and he must have been extremely sick. So after this happens, there are emissaries that are sent from Babel, which we typically know to be Babylon, or the Kashdim people, which we know as Chaldeans. These emissaries are sent to Hezekiah with the pretext that they've come to check on his welfare, that they heard that Hezekiah was very ill, and they had been sent by their king to check on his welfare and see how he is. Such a nice thing. Such a kind, thoughtful gesture. And what Hezekiah does is he ends up pretty much taking them on a tour and showing them all of his great wealth. And you can imagine that the only reason that the king of Babel sent them was because they had their eye on Judah anyways. And after seeing all of their great wealth and him sending them away, Isaiah knew about this because he was coming to him as these emissaries are leaving. And he asks them who they were, and Hezekiah explains to him, and Isaiah says, "Oh my gosh, what did you do, Hezekiah? Because you've acted imprudently, now your children, your grandchildren, they're going to be servants now in the kingdom of Babel." So there's a bit of context so that you can understand that throughout the book of Isaiah, not only are there portions regarding Assyria and the threat of Assyria, but there are great amount of portions regarding Babel and the Chaldeans or Kashidim and their threat on Judah. And more than that, this isn't all about Hezekiah. A lot of this, as with many of the prophets, this mostly has to do with the people, the condition of the people, and how lawless the people tended to be. And because of the people's lawlessness, they would just continue on a slippery slope, the people of Judah. And eventually, even though Assyria took part of Judah and were then stopped at Jerusalem in the time of Hezekiah, eventually it would be other countries, most specifically Babel, who would come and utterly uproot and take Judah away. They would no longer have their own land. They would be servants in a foreign land altogether. Isaiah understood this before his successor Jeremiah came along in the days of these kings that Isaiah was prophesying about. That essentially is your context to what's going on in the days of Isaiah. We begin with the threats of the kings of Israel and Aram. We go to that threat being somewhat taken care of, but then the threat of Asher, that threat being taken care of. Then we have a brief snippet of Mitzrim, which is changed to Egypt in there, where they come in and they take over for just a small amount of time. And then Babel. And Babel is the one that is very significant, that does the greatest amount of damage to the kingdom of Judah and ultimately carries Judah away. There now is our context. Now, keeping that overarching context in mind, we'll go up to Isaiah chapter 53, and I'm going to read it verbatim, the whole chapter, so we can get an idea of what it sounds like. Sort of out of context, but we'll keep the actual context that we understand from the full book of Isaiah and Kings and Chronicles kind of in the back of our head, and read through Isaiah 53. Who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord, or Yahweh, revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there's no beauty that we should desire him. He's despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one to his own way, and Yahweh has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was he stricken. And he was made, and he has made his grave with the wicked and the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was there any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased Yahweh to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of Yahweh shall prosper in his hand. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and he shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he hath poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. So the thing is that this chapter really does seem to be, because I'm sure everybody listening to that, if you were raised in Sunday school, or you have read or heard enough preaching on the New Testament and the Gospels, you would have picked out all of those little snippets throughout that entire chapter that appear to be talking about or prophesying about Jesus. I mean, it was really clear to me when I refreshed my memory on this chapter that it seems to be absolutely loaded with these bits and pieces about what has been written in the Gospels about the let's just say the birth, the life, and the death of Jesus. But there's not close to enough time within the context of one briefs to go into all of this, or to go into all of the language and the terminology, which especially the prophets are just loaded with dubious terminology. I mean, for instance, in line 2, just the word tender is a word that only occurs one time as tender, and when its root occurs in other places, it's a word that's actually very different. We don't have time for that. However, we do have time to take a look at one key term that the whole rest of at least this chapter is anchored on. And it's found in the first verse. Who has believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord, or the arm of Yahweh, revealed? The whole rest of this chapter, at least, should be about this arm of the Lord. And to back that up, I'll go back to my notes here and take a look, because we have three instances of this word that's being used here as arm. In the New Testament, it's based on the Koine Greek term from the Septuagint, brachion. The third occurrence actually is in Acts 13:17, and it's very arguable what it's referring to, because it's talking about the Exodus. The God of this people of Israel chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelt as strangers in the land of Mitzrim, though in the New Testament Koine Greek they do use Egyptus. And with a high arm brought he them out of it. And it's very arguable, of course, based on the context, that we're essentially looking at a euphemism or figure of speech by someone's great strength. So that's why we're not even going to touch that, because it's so highly arguable. But what we will look at is the two other occurrences of this brachios in the New Testament, when it's absolutely clear, based on the context in the New Testament, that we are talking about or equating this arm to Jesus. The first of those two, I'm going to do John before Luke, because it's John and Luke. The first one is John chapter 12, and it's verses 38 to 41. That the sayings of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spoke. Lord, who has believed our report, and to whom hath the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore they could not believe, because that Esaias, or Isaiah, said again, He hath blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, that they should not see with their eyes, nor understand with their heart, and be converted, and I should heal them. These things said Isaiah when he saw his glory, and spake of him. Now, before I get to my notes, let's consider the context also of the book of John and where these verses come from. So in this context, in the book of John, it is said that Jesus had just raised Lazarus from the dead. They were in Jerusalem for a feast. It is said that the religious leaders wanted to try to figure out some way to kill Lazarus so that he would stop telling people that Jesus raised him from the dead. I mean, that's basically our context before we get to those verses. So it's actually helpful if we see that, for instance, because of Lazarus' report, John 12:11 says, because that by reason of him, many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. And it goes on to say, on the next day, much people that were come to the feast when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem took branches of palm trees and went forth to meet him and cried, Hosanna, blessed is the King of Israel that comes in the name of the Lord. And Jesus, when he had found a young ass, sat thereon, as it is written, Fear not, daughter of Zion. Behold, thy king cometh, sitting on an ass's colt. These things understood not his disciples at the first, but when Jesus was glorified, then remembered that they had seen these things were written of him, and that they had done these things unto him. The people, therefore, that were with him when he called Lazarus out of his grave and raised him from the dead, bear record. So it sounds like actually a lot of people were making a big fuss out of him. A lot of people were believing on him. They even created a big spectacle, laying down all these palm branches in front of his ass, donkey, mule, And it says, the Pharisees therefore said amongst themselves, perceive ye how ye prevail nothing. Behold, the world is gone after him. They said, behold, the world! The Pharisees, a very, very, very small group, saying, behold, the world is gone after him. And then we see that the Greeks that came up to worship at the feast, the same, therefore to Philip, which was of Bethsaida of Galilee, and desired him, saying, Sir, we would see Jesus. There's now the Greeks coming. They want to see Jesus. And then we have this certain amount of dialogue from Jesus. And then now it's switched from the Pharisees to the people. In verse 29, it says, the people therefore that stood by and heard it said that it thundered, because we're supposed to be hearing a voice, the voice of God, about glorifying Jesus. Getting the context. We're putting this all in context of the verses that we've seen that are supposed to be referencing what the author of this gospel is saying was a prophecy from Isaiah. So all of these Jews, and then a whole lot of people, a big old group, is making a spectacle to welcome him into Jerusalem. And then a lot of Greeks are all of a sudden, they want to see him. Lots of people are believing on him. So if we pick it up just a couple of verses before that, we'll say 34 says, the people answered him, we have heard out of the law that Christ abideth forever. And how do you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is the Son of Man? Then Jesus said unto them, yet in a little while is the light with you. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness come upon you. For he that walks in darkness knoweth not where he goes. While you have the light, believe in the light, that you may be the children of light. These things spake Jesus, and departed, and did hide himself from them. But though he had done so many miracles before them, yet they believed not on him. Well, this couldn't be all the people. This must have been just some people, because we saw that a whole lot of people believed on him. So many that the religious leaders were conspiring to kill Lazarus just to get rid of the evidence. I mean, that's the context we're seeing. And then we pick it up with John 12:38, that the saying of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spoke, Lord, who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Now, I would have to answer this directly and say, well, quite a few people, which we just saw in context here in the book of John. Actually, quite a few. Just saying, we literally just saw that. And then we can go on to 39, therefore they could not believe, because Isaiah said again. So it seems like this author's adding on. He also said, and we have to believe he's speaking in the same context, or about the same context, being Jesus. Isaiah said again, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, that they should not see with their eyes, nor understand with their heart, and be converted, and I should heal them. Now the interesting thing is, of course, the author of the book of John says at the end there, these things said Isaiah when he saw his glory and spake of him. Now, while John 12:38 is a direct quote from the English of Isaiah 53:1, John 12:40, that verse that we just looked at, is not a direct quote from any verse in Isaiah. It's not a direct quote. This should cause concern. The closest it gets, and we can be pretty confident that what it's aiming at is Isaiah 6:10. From, of course, the context of John, these things said Isaiah when he saw his glory and spake of him. The author of John is suggesting that Isaiah saw the glory of Jesus in this vision. And so we know the closest matching verse is Isaiah 6:10. Make the heart of this people fat, make their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and convert, and be healed. So that's from the KJV. But it's even way off from what we see up here in the Septuagint. We have, "For the heart of this people has become gross," or we can say fat, "and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes have they closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and be converted, and I should heal them." Of course, the first problem is those two translations are at such completely different aspects. One is a request. The author, Isaiah, is literally requesting in not the context of John, but in the context of Isaiah 6:10. Make the heart of this people fat. He's asking him, make it just grow dull and fat, or gross, I suppose, as Brenton gives us. Make their ears heavy, shut their eyes, lest they should see and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and convert and be healed. That's what Isaiah is saying is a request there. But in the Septuagint, it's saying, "For the heart of this people has become gross." It's making a statement of fact of something that did happen. This is a request of something that Isaiah wants to see happen. Interestingly, John 12:40 seems to be just in the aspect, speaking in the past tense, which follows the translation from the Masoretic, which is bizarre because it's supposed to be following, as we're told, the Koine Greek Septuagint version. The big problem is that these aren't equivalent. And the problem with that is, I would think that we should expect some equivalency and some accuracy for one thing. Secondly, I think we should be offended when we see these authors eisegete the texts. This author in John is isolating two different verses from two radically different points in time in the book of Isaiah. These are extremely different points in time. But I suppose the author is trying to tell us, as he eisegetes the text, that any one of these texts can just point to Jesus wherever and however we feel like. And of course, as I've already demonstrated, it is very strange because in this particular chapter in John, we see plenty of people believing on Jesus. Lots of people believing on Jesus. It's a little bit strange. Now, given the fact that not just the reader, but we're going to say, if we assumed that these things happened, that are being relayed to us in the New Testament, also those people are being expected to believe in Jesus, and we're being told they weren't. And this is very high stakes, because we're talking, and we're going to get into the high stakes. How high were the stakes, and how high are the stakes still? The stakes were very high in the sense that they're being expected, or the readers being expected, to exchange the belief in all things that are told in the Old Testament concerning this God Yahweh for the belief in this man who is claiming to be his son, and that he is actually the Savior or instrument, or maybe the arm of this God of Israel. So the stakes are pretty high. We would expect a good deal of accuracy and not an eisegesis in the text. And again, accuracy to the text, which so many of these texts, these purported prophetic references in the New Testament, are not very accurate to their sources in the Old Testament. But before we get further, there's one other quote that we can link this idea of an arm, or at least this same word to, as it would apparently apply to Jesus from the New Testament, and that's Luke chapter 1, verse 51. In Luke 1:51, we have the whole context of Mary and Mary knowing the mother of John the Baptist, Martha, and the father of John the Baptist, and a lot of interactions between Mary and John the Baptist's parents. And the thing is, this whole chapter is not, one thing to keep in mind, it's not echoed, it's not verified in any other source. We only have Luke. And remember, Luke claims to be a better source and a more accurate source than anything that came before him, which would be at least Matthew and Mark. So we have only one witness in the New Testament trying to apply at this time in this way this idea of the arm of the Lord, or the arm of Yahweh. And the thing is, we don't have a direct parallel to Isaiah 53:1, but because this same term is used, a lot of people would say, well, this is definitely at least an indirect reference to what's being said in the entirety of the chapter of Isaiah 53. So in Luke 1:51, this is sort of Mary reflecting on these things as she knows she's going to give birth to this Messiah. And she says, "He hath showed strength with his arm. He hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts." Now the thing is, besides it not having a reference to Isaiah 53:1 or Isaiah period, his arm, as it is frequently used in the Old Testament, could well be his strength. I did mention that earlier, but let's be very clear. She could be referring, just like in Acts. There was that verse in Acts that had the same word in there, that brachios, his strength. And we don't know that this is even a reference to Isaiah 53:1. Mary really couldn't be referring to the unborn baby within her. She's referring to the God as she knows, or would be. Or, basically the God every Christian believes impregnated her, which is a God that is presented in a very different way and many very different aspects to this New Testament God than the Old Testament God. Besides the fact that the New Testament, or most Christians, believe in this sort of triune or Trinity God, most of them believe in this Father God, because that's how he's represented by Jesus in the New Testament. I would also like to note, even though not only can we not directly reference this to Isaiah at all, this "he scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts," I don't even see that reflected in the context of Luke chapter 1, period. So that one's a little weird. And again, like I just mentioned, so many of these prophecies are not only not rewritten in the New Testament accurately, reflecting accurately the text in the Old Testament, but they're always based in texts of the Old Testament which are claimed to be prophecies, which are almost always very dubious, very cryptic, and unfortunately for us, there's always so much room for these question marks. Was that really about Jesus? I don't know, because like in Isaiah 53, it's that maybe a long dissertation or diatribe, whatever you want to call it, where it's so hard to tell, and so it's kind of pulled out of there, and we don't really have anything strong. Like, that not ever once in the entirety of the Old Testament is the Messiah ever named Jesus. Oh, well, once the Messiah is named, Isaiah 7, you mean Emmanuel? Well, the funny thing is, he isn't named Emmanuel, he's named Jesus. So even though multiple characters within the Old Testament are actually named by name before they even show up on the scene, characters like Cyrus by Isaiah. How about characters like King Josiah, named by an early prophet in 1 Kings, to the first king of the house of Israel, which would be Jeroboam. We literally have people that come a long time later who wouldn't be nearly as important as Jesus is said to be, who are named by name. I mean, it's accurate. In fact, the prophet that goes to the first Jeroboam, there was 2 Jeroboams for the house of Israel, he tells him very specifics about what this King Josiah would do. Gives him specifics, and they all come to pass as per the biblical record later on. Same thing with Cyrus. Yet, we don't even have Jesus named, and we don't have this clarity of prophecy that we should expect if we're looking at prophecies regarding the man who was supposed to be the most important man to ever live. And if you're going to put all of your faith and confidence in this man, we should expect to see some really strong, very accurate, articulated prophecies. And it's not as though the Bible doesn't have plenty of very strong, well-articulated prophecies. Here's the funny thing. The Bible is loaded with them. The Old Testament is loaded with them. Plenty of accurate prophecies that we see fulfilled. Now, whatever someone's opinion might be about the Bible as far as how authentic or disauthentic it is, how authentic or disauthentic either the Old Testament or the New Testament is, it's supposed to be one giant book telling one giant story from the Old Testament to the New Testament. That's what it's supposed to be. That's what Christians say they believe. One continuous story. Well, here's the thing. In the Old Testament, we have loads of examples of extremely accurate prophecies that are not cloudy, not weird. Real characters are named by name, what they're going to do, when it's going to happen, very, very specifically with lots of clarity. But somehow we don't have that specificity and clarity when we get to Jesus in the New Testament, and that's a problem. And I'm going to give you a few examples of how clear the prophecies of the Old Testament actually are. We can start at Genesis chapter 6. Yahweh tells Noah he's bringing a flood. Genesis chapter 7, we see Yahweh in fact bringing a flood. Accurate, clear, unmistakable. Genesis 12:12, to Abram, Yahweh prophesies that he will make him a great nation. And Exodus forward, we see this abundantly fulfilled throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Unmistakable. And we see it through his genealogy to the 12 sons of Jacob, and them growing in Mitzrayim, and then coming out this great people, and then getting even bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as the Bible goes on. Clear, accurate, unmistakable. Genesis 13:14 through 18. Yahweh promises Abram's descendants all the land of Canaan, and Joshua 21:43. It's fulfilled. And, well, all the book of Joshua, we see this entirely all filled out. But Joshua 21:43 literally says that all of that land that was promised to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was taken, was given to them. Accurate, clear, unmistakable, precise. Genesis 15:4, Yahweh tells Abraham, out of his own body, Abraham's own body, will come his heir, not his servant. He thought, I'm not going to have a kid. I'm old. My servant Eliezer is going to have to be my heir. Yahweh says, no. From your own body, your own loins is going to come your heir that I'm promising you. He promised it would be through Sarah in Genesis 17:16. Genesis 17:19, quote, "You will call his name Isaac." Then we see in Genesis 21, 1 through 3, Sarah gives birth that Abraham fathered to a baby that they call Isaac. Accurate, clear, unmistakable. How about Genesis 21:13? Yahweh promises to make Ishmael a great nation. Then we see in Genesis 25, all Ishmael's sons are listed, and forward it is seen that Ishmael is a great people. Accurate, unmistakable. You couldn't even argue it. Genesis 15:13, Yahweh tells Abraham his seed would be strangers in a land, not theirs, and afflicted for 400 years. Genesis and Exodus bear this out. 200 plus years in Canaan, and 200 plus a little bit of change years in Mitzrayim, wrongly called Egypt. 430 years altogether, but when it's seen that Isaac was born some 15 years later, it's far closer to 400 years, and I don't think anyone's going to argue over some change when we're talking about 4 centuries. Accurate, clear, unmistakable. Over and over, Yahweh confirms to Isaac and Jacob that he will make them into a great nation and give them Canaan, which again is fulfilled from the book of Numbers to the book of Judges. Accurate, unmistakable. How about Joseph? We can get into something that some people might say, well, there might be a lack of clarity in dreams and visions. No, there's not. Joseph has dreams which are full of symbols and are accurately interpreted by him and then come to pass. In the record, they come to pass clearly and accurately just as he told them. Joseph accurately interprets the dreams of Pharaoh's baker and butler, and those things come to pass according to the record in Genesis. Joseph accurately interprets Pharaoh's dreams, the 7 years of famine and plenty. They come to pass with accuracy. This is why Joseph is made the second most powerful man in Mitzrayim. Accuracy, because no one could argue that he was absolutely right on, and therefore he had to be acting as the instrument of the only one true God by telling Pharaoh there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. You save up everything that comes in those years of plenty so that you'll have plenty in those 7 years of famine. And it happens. And Joseph is raised to a great height in Mitzrayim. And that is exactly how that first dream he had, that he gave them the interpretation. My father, my mother, my brothers, they'll all bow down to me. Because he'd be that powerful. And he was. Because Mitzrayim turned out to be the most powerful land all around, and everybody came to Mitzrayim to get food because there was such an egregious famine, the likes that no one had ever seen probably before or since. Accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. So while those above quotes are written for the sake of the reader, why did no one at the time cite these prophecies as coming to pass in real time? And I mean the prophecies that were being told, that are being quoted and referenced in the New Testament from the Old Testament that are supposed to be about Jesus. Why did no one quote these in real time in the gospel? In the Old Testament, Yahweh brings about all prophecies openly and publicly. There's no secrets. Yet in the New Testament, Jesus wants it to mostly be a secret that he's the Messiah, the Son of God. Claim this is supposed to be the most important thing coming. He's like, don't tell anybody. It's a secret. And we only see these very limited kind of strange exchanges between him and the religious leaders, or him and maybe some people. We have a few passages claiming things like, I am he which is spoken of then, or Abraham looked forward to me, but The thing is, those are just their empty claims to say things like that. They are. Because you don't have the sharpness of accuracy required to directly apply a prophecy to you. Why in the Gospels narratives didn't Jesus just say, here's the accurate Old Testament quote, and here is how I am presently fulfilling it? And no, you don't get to apply when he said in a gospel to go to a synagogue and read a passage and say, today that passage is fulfilled. There was nothing being fulfilled then. Anyone could have read that passage and made the same claim. We are not talking about the accurate fulfillment of prophecy that we just saw over and over and over and over in Genesis, and I didn't even get out of Genesis. As far as the source quotes of prophecy, I didn't even get out of the book of Genesis. And that's how accurate Old Testament prophecies are. They're absolutely unmistakable. But throughout the Gospels, they're so mistakable. They're so dubious. They're cloudy. So maybe it's either because the Pharisees, Sadducees, or scribes would then need to argue or confirm it within the narrative. And we'd have to see some kind of back and forth dialogue like that. If they confirmed it, there would be no reason they should deny his claims. The whole narrative of Jesus as the Messiah is surrounded by dubious references to many isolated, claimed, purported prophecies. Isolated texts, that's the key. Eisegesis, or as I heard one person put it, I see Jesus. That's a problem. It really is. It truly is a problem. This isn't me making problems. This is me saying that's a problem when I compare how dubious and cloudy and unsure all of these purported prophetic references in the New Testament are concerning Jesus, as when we just contrast and compare that to all of the blatantly obvious, accurate, clear prophecies we see fulfilled in the Old Testament. It's a serious problem. Now, that being said, let's go back to Isaiah 53:1. Who hath believed our report? This is in the English. And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? As I said, this and other passages are full of all kinds of linguistic question marks. One of them is interesting too, just right here in this verse, and here it is. At best, this verse in Hebrew, and you can check it in Hebrew, I've got it written here in Obery, which again is the same exact letters or characters or glyphs, simply written in a slightly different form, which is admitted in the reference books to be an older form. They admit there was a form before this. Look, I can put it right in. I'm just going to put it on screen so everybody can see I'm not using any trickery when I show it to you in Obery, okay? It's the same exact characters. We've got a mem and we've got a yod right here for me. And we'll go back here. Look, see, the mem or the M and yod or Y, it's exactly the same. Okay, just establishing that. So when we look at this in Hebrew or Obery, we can see that, for one thing, there's no definite article on this zeruo, which is supposed to be the arm. Now, I'm not going to get us rabbit trailing, but the thing is, most of the time when we see zeruo or zero, it's usually seed. But we don't have to get ahead of ourselves. Maybe it is. Maybe it is, but we have the same term, zeruo, which is translated the arm, which we saw in the New Testament as arm, remember? So it's the New Testament that has to convince us that these prophecies about Jesus are accurate. So for the time being, we'll just go ahead, okay, arm, zeruo, arm. The problem is, for one thing, we don't have the definite article here between the so-called vav, or u, and the so-called zayin, or z. We should see a definite article here. Without the definite article, at best it says an arm. That's a problem, because Jesus can't be an. He can't be an. Not with all of those things that we saw or I read in Isaiah 53 going forward. We can't start this whole thing. Who has believed our report? And who is an arm of the Lord revealed? That's not specific at all. We have to be specific. We should demand specificity if we're going to put our faith in Jesus as the Messiah, as our Savior, as the one who paid for our sins and by whose stripes we are purportedly healed. And you have to understand that the reason that I become impassioned about these things is because they're very, very important. If someone is misled and they go down a terrible path of destruction, destructive behavior towards others, because they believe something that is incorrect, I get very angry about it. I myself have been misled many, many, many times in my life. I see people all around me that are being misled all the time, and it makes me angry. So this is why, this is one very, very big reason why we should demand accuracy. Demand accuracy. It is not the arm. This is and an arm. And by the way, to whom is not in there. Again, at best, it would say and an arm of Yahweh upon. I'm not joking. Check. That is at best what this could be saying. But the thing is, the entire rest of that chapter is, and the verses, the references we saw in the New Testament, they're all predicated on the idea that this figure, this perhaps metaphor, or whomever we're talking about for the rest of Isaiah 53, and as they say, all dotted throughout Isaiah and the other prophets, and as that one author claims, Jesus on every page. So we're operating off the fact that the entirety of Isaiah chapter 53 is about this figure who is first introduced to us in Isaiah 53:1 as the arm. So besides for the fact that they changed the grammar, and therefore also the syntax of this, we still have to deal with this arm. Let's go back to our context. Remember, Isaiah, he's living through all of these turbulent changes that were happening to Aram, to the house of Israel, and were happening also to the house of Judah. This would have been one of the worst times that anyone alive could have ever remembered. Terrible things are happening. Great shifts in kingdoms and powers, and huge wars are taking place in Isaiah's time. This was not like little insignificant things were happening, so he had a lot of time to write wonderful poetry about who knows what. His book would have been very focused on things happening and things shortly to come that would have everything to do with the lives, the condition, and the futures of those people. So what we want to see, though, if we want to keep in context and not allow for pulling verses out of context however we want to, which most Christians would take offense to if, let's just say, some other Christian professor or learned scholar was telling him that some bad actor, some bad character was using eisegesis to teach them something that they claimed was incorrect. They'd be outraged. They'd say they can't do that. They can't just isolate the texts like that. Well, the problem is, we see whoever wrote the book of John doing just that. We see whoever wrote the book of Luke doing just that. They're eisegeting texts unless we can put this in context, which we've began to build the context of Isaiah, understanding everything that's going on in Isaiah. And mostly by this point in time in Isaiah 53, Assyria would have already done a lot of their damage in the north. This is happening over many years. Isaiah lived to be an old man, and there's no proof, by the way. There's no proof whatsoever that Isaiah was ever sawn asunder by Manasseh or any other king. He lived in the reign of 4 kings. He lived a very long time, and his book is being written over a very long time. And before we get to chapter 53, all of that business with the house of Israel and Aram being taken over or invaded, being subdued by Assyria, and then Assyria invading Judah, taking certain cities, and then surrounding Jerusalem, and Yahweh killing this huge part of Sennacherib's army, him retreating, going back, his sons murder him, and there's a good deal of chaos going on, so obviously they recede from Judah. Hezekiah gets sick. Hezekiah is healed. His life is extended by 15 years by Yahweh. The emissaries of Babel come. Isaiah finds this out, and then Isaiah gives Hezekiah a prophecy that Babel is coming. Now, Babel's not coming necessarily because of something wrong with Hezekiah. It's something dreadfully, dreadfully wrong with the people, but Babel is coming. And we know from the context of all of the other prophets that no nation comes and takes over any other nation lest they be an instrument being used by Yahweh himself. So with that in mind, let's just check the book of Isaiah to see if Isaiah can contextualize for us who maybe would be this arm. Remember, not the arm. There's no definite article. How about an arm of Yahweh? Let's see if Isaiah can show us who an arm of Yahweh is. Now, we first see it in Isaiah 30:30. And Yahweh shall cause his glorious voice to be heard, and shall show the lightning down of his arm, with the indignation of his anger, and with the flame of a devouring fire, with scattering, and tempest, and hailstones. And before anybody starts to say, well, that sounds a lot like when Jesus said he saw Satan fall like lightning, that's not even close. You'd have to read really, you'd have to squint and look at that sideways to try to connect those two things. No, he's talking about, it says, Yahweh's glorious voice will be heard, and he'll show light. Now, hold on a second. Lightning? Not quite. Because the word is nechat, okay? And it's always come down. Sometimes rest, but almost always translated as down, except for one time they throw lightning in here. But typically, all forms of nechat are come down and broken down. We're talking about the oppression, the destruction, or violent acts, which we can see in the rest of the verse, by the way, of someone who is being referred to as not only the arm, an arm, because again, we don't have the definite article, but also a voice and an arm, or a noise and an arm. And in the next verse, the voice of Yahweh shall beat down the Assyrian. So who now is the voice if Jesus is the arm? And what did Jesus or anyone have to do with Assyria? If we put it in context, we see an arm here. We see an arm in Isaiah 53:1. We have to somehow get our definition from Isaiah. Is this arm really Jesus? Because in the context of Isaiah 30:30, it certainly does not look to be the case. Now again we see an arm in Isaiah 40:10 and 11. It reads, "Behold, the Lord God will come with a strong hand." We got a hand now. "And his arm shall rule for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his work before him. He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm, and carry them in his bosom, and shall gently lead those that are with young." Aw, that does sound kind of Jesus-y. In fact, the first verse in that kind of sounds like from Revelation, right? Here he comes, his reward is with him. I mean, it does, it sounds like it. But are these texts isolated and eisegeted so that whomever is writing the New Testament can make us believe whatever it is they want us to believe? There's plenty of weirdness, of course, in these two verses, like, for instance, the word Philim. It's only translated once as lambs, so that it can make it seem more like a shepherd. Most of the time, it's typically translated as spotted, speckled, being diverse, not lambs. Now, forms of another word in here, his bosom, hiqua, are more frequently translated as statutes, as in rules, as in governing rules, laws. And there's no gently to the word ne'el. It's only to guide, to lead, or maybe even to direct. Ne'el. So they have to do a lot of fooling around with the text, besides the fact that they keep wanting to present the arm as like the one thing, as opposed to an arm, as in an agent, not the, an agent. They have to constantly switch around, tweak words. We constantly see words that only one time are they translated in a certain way to make it seem, oh, this arm, it's going to lead these lambs, take the lambs in its bosom. The funny thing is, before this, in this context of Isaiah 40, we see far more impending and dark verses, like the voice said, "Cry," and he said, "What shall I cry? That all flesh is grass, and all the goodliness thereof is as the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, because the breath," they say spirit, the breath of Yahweh blows upon it. What happens when the breath of Yahweh blows on something? It withers and it fades. It's not saying something happy and cheerful. We're talking about something that was impending. Destruction, doom was coming. The prophet Isaiah saw this. Judah, like her sister Israel, was about to experience some horrific times for centuries worth of very bad behavior. Those things were coming on an enormous population of people, not just of Judah, Judah, the house of Israel, her neighbors, Mitzrayim. These were very serious events that happened to a lot, and I mean a lot, of people at this time. Not happy and cheery. And of course they have to change a lot of words to make it sound like very happy, Jesus-like passages as they eisegete the text. Now, to further demonstrate the problem of this arm being Jesus, as these two New Testament, two gospel books try to convince us of, we have Isaiah 51:5. My righteousness is near, my salvation is gone forth, and mine arms, with an S, my arms shall judge the people. The isles shall wait upon me, and on mine arm shall they trust. Now, which is it? Is it a singular arm, as in Jesus? Is he the arm? Are we talking about arms? Because that's literally a plural. Arms shall judge the people. This all of a sudden really detracts or adds or augments the fact that we see no definite article in Isaiah 53:1 for this arm that supposedly those two gospel authors are referring to. And before I go any further, I just realized I skipped the most important verse. And I realized that looking at my notes, I'd skipped the most important verse to us identifying who this arm, or the arms, or an arm, could be as defined by Isaiah in his same very book of Isaiah, Isaiah 48:14. Now here's how the English reads, All ye assemble yourselves and hear, which among them hath declared these things? Yahweh hath loved him. He will do his pleasure on Babylon, or Babel, and his arm shall be on the Chaldeans. Well, first off, it's a little strange that his arm, are we talking about Jesus, should be on the Chaldeans. Because then it gets bizarre and there's all kinds of questions about what could that possibly mean. But the thing is, what we're going to see is, based on the source text, that's not at all what's being said. So here's the thing about the actual wording of that verse, as it stands, okay? So we do have this Eosha, so to do or make. We've got this chapatsu, and we can say it's his pleasure. Okay, but what we have after that is we have either in Babel or by Babel. And after that we have zerou, his arm. This is very important. What we don't have after his arm is shall be on. Shall be on. We have nothing indicating shall be on. We have essentially will make or do his pleasure by or with or in Babel, and zerou, his arm, followed immediately by kashadim, or as they transliterate it, really, the Chaldeans. It's a bad transliteration, but you get the point. So literally the way that verse is worded, it is saying that he is going to accomplish his will and his pleasure by way of or via Babel and his arm, Chaldea, the Kasdim. So we literally see who Isaiah is calling the arm of Yahweh. Who's that? The Chaldeans. Now I can follow that up with my notes on the next verse, which I began reading before that verse. Chapter 51 is contrasting the judgment by Yahweh's arms. Remember, we just saw these arms of judgment. My arm. He's contrasting his judgment on all and his mercy on some. That whole chapter, chapter 51. On some he has mercy, that being the righteous, but his arms are judgment on all. Who are his arms? Babel, the Chaldeans, Assyria, Mitzrim, Paris, which of course has been changed to Persia, and Madi, which has been transliterated as Medes, and they say it was some empire in the Middle East, just like the Persians. If the arm or arms are Jesus, is the Son of Man also Jesus? Because we see that in another verse in chapter 51. They say the Son of Man is like grass. Remember grass that gets withered by the breath of Yahweh? See, can we make of any Masoretic expression whatever we please? Is this chapter not full of judgment on Israel and Judah on the one hand, and their oppressor, Babel, on the other? Because that's what this chapter is telling us. He'll use his arms as judgments on Israel and Judah, his people, and he'll bring judgment on that agent or his arm that he used to judge them. But how do far-flung interpretive prophecies benefit those being spoken to in Isaiah's day? When we look at this in context, and we can clearly identify who Yahweh is calling his arm or his arms, we can see how that would benefit the people of Isaiah's day that he spoke this to. And we actually get some clarity about Isaiah 53:1. We get at least some clarity regarding that. Whereas if we believe what New Testament writers are claiming about these arms on the one hand, and then switching from one chapter being 53 all the way back to chapter 6:10 on the other, they're just eisegeting, they're isolating the texts, and they're using them, the authors of the New Testament are using them in any way they want. And the way they get to do that is through lack of clarity, which is why we need to do things like this and clarify, put things in context, see if we can identify terms like the arm or an arm or arms. So after seeing this clearly illustrated, contextualizing, defining the terms, we can see this idea of, at least in Isaiah 53, this arm character being Jesus starting to quickly fall apart. So the next question is a logical question that somebody could ask, is why would anyone want to mislead us concerning our salvation and the true God? Well, I've covered this before. First off, there's the idea of salvation in the New Testament as opposed to the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, salvation is always a here and now saving. It is always, if you do these things and you keep the law, you will have good things come about in your life here and now, in this life. There's no promises or talk of things to come. We're talking about right here, right now, things you can grab onto. That's salvation. In the Old Testament, that's how it's defined in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it's redefined as, if you're a good little boy and girl, you will get some kind of heaven, pleasure, something in the hereafter. One reason to mislead us is to avert our focus from what we could have here and now by way of being lawful to what we might have in some afterlife. And that's going to change people's behaviors radically. You know this. You've seen this. You've probably done it. I have in the past. Thinking about things like rapture or how heaven's going to be better because everything about life stinks. Or a lot of it. It shifts our focus from what we're promised through our lawful obedience now to what we might have to count on for being good little boys and girls, especially good little boys and girls for the state, and acting in certain ways that they sculpt that the new righteous man should act in the New Testament, as opposed to what we see a righteous man being in the Old Testament. So, another reason is, which ties directly into this, is so that they can rule over us. They can rule over all those people who worship a false god, a myth over the true God, Yahweh, the God of Israel. And we see this reflected in the blessings and the cursings promised in Deuteronomy 28. We also see that this is an egregious offense and is the first commandment. I'm the God who brought you out of Mitzrayim. You will worship only me. Those who break his commandments and are lawless, it says in Deuteronomy 28, you will not be the head, you will be the tail. I will bring other nations. They will rule over you. They will cast you all over the earth. They will chase you. You will not be strong. You will not have many children. You will not spread your seed. Do you understand? If we go after idols, if we go after false gods, we are promised a very bad existence here, now. That is a very important concept, because if the people secretly ruling over us through lies and deception have convinced us that what we need to do is we need to be like Jesus and the apostles, which, based on everything in the New Testament, we believe that righteousness equals humility and suffering, martyrdom, maybe death, just like Jesus and the apostles. But Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel, he doesn't expect these things from us for us to be counted as righteous, but the keeping of his laws, which Yahweh himself told Israel is absolutely doable, not impossible, such as Paul and all Christian preachers convince you of today. It's not impossible. Yahweh says it's absolutely impossible. We see that in Deuteronomy 30, 11 through 15. Yahweh says it's doable. Here's Deuteronomy 30, 11 through 15. For this commandment which I command you this day is not hidden from you, neither is it far off. It's not in heaven, that you should say, who shall go up to heaven and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea, that you should say, who should go over the sea for us and bring it unto us, that we may hear and do it? The word is very near unto you, in your mouth, in your heart, that you may do it. He says over and over again, all his laws, all his commandments, all his statutes are totally doable. How cruel to threaten life and death contingent upon a law no one could hope to keep. If Yahweh says anyone can keep the law, there's no need for a special perfect sacrifice such as Jesus, because Yahweh says anyone can keep the law. Yahweh even calls many men righteous. How is one righteous if no one can keep the law? He calls many men throughout the Old Testament righteous. Don't say faith. Faith like Abraham. Faith like Abraham. Because Yahweh tells Isaac later on that that Abraham is righteous because he keeps his laws and his statutes and his judgments. Why make up the Gospels? Why make up the New Testament, which changes everything about the Old Testament? To rule over people. Why would Yahweh let the people who are secretly ruling over us through lies and deception do so? Well, for the same reason that he let Assyria, which wasn't a righteous nation, rule over Israel and Judah and many other countries, for the sake of judgment and for his will to come to pass, so that hopefully the people would turn because of that oppression. It's the same reason why he let Mitzrayim, not Egypt, rule for a number of years, and then after that Babel, and after that Paris and Mede, and after that this mysterious nation we see called Yun, which they changed to Javan or Greece. He does it to accomplish his will. He allows them to do all these things. He even wills it to accomplish his will. It's my hope that we'll be able to see through all the lies, all of the deceptions, and that we'll gain some kind of clarity as far as how bad things can really get if we aren't vigilant and diligent in trying to recapture, acquire, and acquaint ourselves with all the things we've lost due to all of the bad behaviors and lawlessness of our fathers and ourselves. So there is abundant motives present for a group of people to entirely change the messages that we see in the Old Testament to very remarkably, profoundly different messages in the New Testament. And because there is a motive for them to do so, which is rule and power, their own power. These people in power have everything. They have all kinds of power. And people who like power are oftentimes willing to do anything to keep it. They're willing to do anything to acquire it. So since there's such a great amount of motive to change all of these things, so that not only the remnants of Israel and Judah that are left in the world would worship false gods, but so that the whole world would do so, and that they may secure their place as rulers of the world in perpetuity. Who knows for how long? I don't know. Hopefully, if everybody does what's right and worships the true God, and once again acquires what his law really says, and by diligence can even see in the English, with just a rudimentary understanding of a few things about Hebrew or Obri, they start picking apart all of the problems with this New Testament narrative and the problems that are inherent in the language as it stands, i.e. the Masorah that's been applied to the Old Testament text. Hopefully, more and more and more and more people will see the importance of doing these things, will feel the pain of the dysfunction of this entire world, life, and the reality that we've been presented. And once more and more and more people start understanding that, start seeing that, start doing things about it, not only helping and supporting me, but doing things about it, yourself doing things about it, that this will all change very quickly. Very, very quickly. That's my hope. And that's the reason that I do this. So with that, I'll end this brief with one more thank you to David Schaefer for sponsoring it, and a call out to anyone out there. Please consider sponsoring a brief yourself. Please pick up some merchandise in the store. It's good stuff. I designed it all myself, and it's actually good products. Please pick up a copy of my book, The Bible versus the Middle East, Volume 1. Or, if you don't feel like doing any of those things, maybe you'll just send a donation. I would appreciate that as well. Go to my Patreon. There's a lot to get over at my Patreon, actually. There are weekly audios at different tiers. There are articles. There are other things that I try to bring to you all the time. So with that, I'm going to wrap this episode of tOP Briefs, and I will see you again in the next one.